So, welcome everyone, and let's spend a few more minutes making sure that our motivation for being here and participating in this course is as positive as possible. So, first, just go into your mind and ask yourself, why are you here participating in this course, listening to this talk? What is your motivation? Some of you might find curiosity, thinking it sounds like an interesting topic. I wonder what it's all about. I'd like to learn more about it. Sometimes our ego can be involved in our motivation. For example, a sense of competitiveness. Knowledge is valuable. People who have knowledge are often respected and can even become well-known teachers or writers. So we might feel a bit competitive with people who know more than we do, and we want to know as much as they do, have as much knowledge as they do, have more knowledge than other people who haven't studied this particular topic. So if you notice any kind of attitude like that, that is not really the correct attitude to have. The most positive and beneficial motivation that we could have for learning any Dharma topic, anything involved in the Buddhist teachings, is altruism, thinking about others, wanting to benefit others, to help them have less suffering, and help them have greater peace and happiness, genuine happiness. Learning about the mind is very important in order to have less suffering and more happiness, because according to Buddhism, our mind is the source. And the Buddha even said the mind is the creator of our experiences. So if we do want to help others have more happiness and less suffering, we need to know about the mind, how the mind works. And we need to start with ourselves, with our own mind. Learning about our own mind. What kind of factors in our mind are the cause of happiness and peace, and which ones bring suffering and confusion. So if we learn this about our own mind and put it into practice, we'll be in a better position to be able to help others do the same when they are facing problems, difficulties, confusion, unhappiness. We'll have more knowledge with which we can benefit them. So try to bring that state of mind into your mind as your reason, your motivation for learning about this topic, that it's to benefit not only yourself, but others, other people, other beings. And if you're comfortable with the idea of becoming enlightened, which is the highest goal in Buddhism, and the reason for becoming enlightened is to be able to help all other beings in the best possible way and guide them completely out of suffering and to the perfect peace and bliss of enlightenment as well. So if you're comfortable with that idea, you can bring that in as well, thinking of that as your long-term goal. And then the short-term goal is to be able to help others as much as you can from this time on. So this weekend, we're having a follow-up course to a weekend course held in June 19th and 20th. Some of you may have attended that. And if you didn't, I think the videos are available on the website, so you can watch those if you wish to. But in this weekend, we're going to be looking at different material than the last time. We're going to be looking at mental factors mainly. But I will start today by repeating a few of the main things mentioned last time, in case there's some of you who didn't attend that. And then I'll move on to introduce new material. And then we'll also have another weekend course in November, part 3 of Know Your Mind, because there's a lot of mental factors. We usually study 51 mental factors, and that's a lot to do in one weekend. So I thought I'll divide them up. We'll do some this weekend and others the following week in November. And I made a set of notes that should have been emailed to you if you registered. And I think it's also available to download from the Abbey website. So that's kind of the basis for what I'm going to be doing this weekend. I'll be going through these notes and explaining this. Yeah, there was also another file, which is a translation of a text on mental factors. There aren't too many books or texts on this topic, but this is a text by Kachin Yeshe-Gelsen, and it's used in the FPMT basic program and master's program, so we've been given permission to use it for this course. That's more like supplementary material. If you want to read more about the topic, it has a lot more information, but we don't have time to go through all of it. So I've kind of condensed the main points in what I'm going to be presenting. This topic of mind, different types of mind, mental factors, and so on, is called Lorig in Tibetan. Lo, it means mind, and Rig also means mind. So it's like there's many different words for mind in Tibetan and in Sanskrit and in Pali. It's maybe similar to, they say that the Eskimos have 20 different words for snow. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway, because there are different kinds of snow. Not all snow is the same. And so it's similar with our mind. Our mind is actually very complex, and there's many different types of mind and different aspects of mind, different ways of looking at mind. And so there are these different words, different terms for mind, which makes it a bit challenging when you're trying to translate it into other languages. English, I guess, is is a good language compared to other languages. Like I heard a friend who's Swedish and says it's very difficult to find in Swedish all these different terms for mind, but English is much more rich. But anyway, this topic can be quite complex. When it's studied in the monasteries, the Tibetan monks and nuns study this usually early on in their education programs, because it kind of forms the basis for more advanced studies, like learning about emptiness, for example, because what we're trying to do there is develop a mind that understands emptiness, a wisdom that understands emptiness. And we're trying to overcome mistaken minds, like ignorance, which doesn't understand emptiness, but even sees things in a completely wrong way. So it's very important to understand the mind and how it can sometimes be so correct and so beneficial, and other times it can be so wrong and devastating. So they study Lorig and learn kind of the basic terminology. It's almost like the ABCs of the mind. Then that gives them a foundation for the more advanced philosophical studies. So it's a very, very important topic. And even if one isn't doing that kind of education, the monastic education, it's still very useful to know about the mind just to be happier in our daily life. Because, as I mentioned during the motivation, according to Buddhism, all our experiences come from the mind. There are many, many quotations where the Buddha spoke about this, how the mind is the source of all good experiences like happiness and peace, and higher states of mind like liberation and enlightenment. But also, mind is the source of all the terrible sufferings, like what's going on in the world right now. It really boils down to mistaken states of mind, deluded states of mind that people don't know how to manage. They come up and they just take over, and people are acting out these delusions or these afflictions and creating so much suffering for themselves and others. And so it's so important to understand the mind and what it is and how it works, so that then we can start working on it. That's the real point. The real point is to understand the mind so we can work on the mind. And that's really the essence of Buddhism. The whole Buddhist path is really about learning to manage our mind so that we create more positive states of mind that are the causes of happiness and good experiences and higher attainments, realizations, and diminish or decrease the negative states of mind, the ones that lead to suffering and confusion. Yeah, so it's really the essence of Buddhism, transforming our mind. And to transform our mind, we need to understand the mind. So that's the reason or the purpose for engaging in this study. And then the more we can understand about our own mind and learn how to manage our own mind, the better we'll be able to understand other people's minds. And when they are confused and suffering and acting out afflictive emotions, we'll be in a better position to help them. And even if we can't help them, to at least have compassion for them rather than getting fed up with them and impatient and giving up on them. Okay, so today we'll start by, like I say, a few things that were already covered in the previous weekend, but it doesn't hurt to review them. Just looking at what the mind is according to Buddhism. So there's a definition in the little handout. The first point, letter A, is what is the mind? And the definition of mind, I have / awareness because different translators will translate the same Tibetan word using different English words. So this Tibetan term lo, it looks like it's blow, but the B is silent. So it's lo, lo. So some translators translated that as mind, others translate it as awareness. So that's why I put those two alternatives there. So anyway, that word, or rather what that is defined as clarity and knowing. So those terms need explanation, which you can find below. So clarity, or sometimes translated as clear, this refers to the non-materiality of the mind, the fact that mind is not material, not physical. So it's not made of atoms or any kind of physical particles. It's totally non-physical, non-material. It also doesn't have any physical properties like color or shape or tangibility. So it's not something we can see, not something we can touch. And so, yeah, it cannot be perceived by any of our senses. And that also includes the instruments that scientists use to study, like the body and the brain and so on and so forth. So the mind, mind, or another term for mind is consciousness. So sometimes you come across that term. So mind or consciousness cannot be detected by any of the instruments of that scientists have come up with. Maybe one day they'll develop an instrument that can detect the mind, but I don't know. Their instruments usually only deal with material things that are composed of material particles like molecules and atoms and so on. So something that doesn't have those properties, totally non-material, non-physical, it's very difficult to study it using those kind of instruments. So in Buddhism, what we use to study the mind is the mind itself. So mind itself is the one and only instrument that can be used to look at the mind and study the mind and understand the mind. So again, that indicates how important it is to know what the mind is and how to work with the mind, because that's the only thing that can be used to transform the mind, work with the mind. Oh, I made a boo-boo here. So, yeah, I put the definition of mind is clarity and knowing. And then when I came to the explanation of it, instead of using the word knowing, I used the word awareness. But anyway, the second term in the definition of mind, sometimes it's translated as knowing. It's rikpa in Tibetan. Some translators translate it as knowing, some translate it as awareness. Anyway, the meaning of that is simply that the mind knows, or the mind experiences, or that the mind is aware of an object. So that's describing the function of the mind. The word clarity or clear is describing kind of the mind's nature, what it is, what kind of stuff it is. It's not a physical stuff, it's a non-material, non-physical stuff. And then the second term, knowing or awareness, describes what the mind does. What is its function? And that is to know. So the mind knows, and synonymous with that would be experience. The mind experiences things, or the mind is aware of things. So that may sound kind of abstract, but if we just consider like this very moment, or this period of time, what we are experiencing. So I'm talking and you're hearing the sound of my voice. So that experience of hearing the sound of my voice, that is your mind. It's your mind that is hearing my voice. And if you have your eyes open, then you're seeing things, the other people in the room, the furniture, and so on. So that experience of seeing things, visual experience, that's also the mind. It's the mind that sees, that has visual experiences. And if you're feeling sensations in your body, maybe you're feeling hot or cold, or hungry or thirsty, or tired or sick, or maybe you're feeling comfortable. So whatever physical sensations that we have at this moment, that's also our mind. It's our mind that is experiencing those physical sensations. And if there's any odors in the air, the experience of those odors, those smells, is also the mind. And if you have a taste in your mouth from whatever you were eating or drinking before, or the toothpaste you used to brush your teeth, so that experience of tasting, that's also our mind. So those are our five senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and then body sense. Okay, so according to Buddhism, it's actually our mind that is having those experiences, or that is those experiences. Okay, so mind is that which knows, which experiences things. And then we also have a sixth sense we call the mental sense, or mental consciousness. And that's probably the most complex one, because that includes all of our thoughts. And I don't know about you, but that one is busy all day long, all night long too. Coming up with dreams. Yeah, so all of our thoughts, and our thoughts can take different forms. Some of them are memories of even what we did 5 minutes ago or an hour ago. So memories from earlier today, as well as from yesterday, last week, last year, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, childhood, and so on. So all those memories, whenever those are happening in our mind, that's our mind. It's our mind that is experiencing those memories, knowing those memories. And then we sometimes think about the future, plans for what we're going to do later, today, tomorrow, next week, and so on. So those are thoughts about the future. So that's also part of this sixth sense or sixth consciousness, the mental one. And then our emotions, our feelings are also included in that sixth sense. So that's a very busy one, a very complex one, and a very important one. That's actually the most important one for bringing about a transformation of our mind. Because our afflictive emotions like anger, desire, jealousy, arrogance are included in that sixth consciousness. And so those are the ones that get us into trouble that we want to work on decreasing and eventually overcoming. And then the positive qualities that we want to develop, such as compassion and love and wisdom, are also in that sixth part of the mind, the sixth sense, sixth consciousness. So that's a very, very important one, the source of our troubles. But the other five are important as well, because the five sense consciousnesses, it's kind of like they take in information from the environment, from the outside, and feed it to the mental consciousness, and then the mental consciousness processes that and comes up with either afflictive states of mind or positive virtuous states of mind or just neutral ones. So all the different aspects of the mind are important. But anyway, I was just trying to give you a practical sense of what the mind is. We're looking at all these different words, these different terms, but if we just look inside, we turn our attention inside and observe what's happening, we can see that, okay, that's what mind is. It is that part of us that knows, that experiences, that is aware of an object. And what I have learned is mind always has an object. There's always an object. There's always something that mind is aware of. You cannot just have mind without an object, without something that is dealt with, experienced, engaged with. Okay? And the object could be something external, like when we see things, we're seeing things usually outside of ourselves. So our five senses are usually experiencing, not just usually. Well, yeah, we can also have internal objects, like when you have a tummy ache. That's inside. Your body consciousness is experiencing, those sensations in your tummy. Yeah, so that's an internal object. But much of the time we are involved with external objects like people that we see and animals and the things in nature or the things in our environment, buildings and cars and so on. So the things out there. Okay, so those are objects of our sense, our consciousnesses. And the mental consciousness can deal with any kind of object because we can think about the things that we see and hear and so on. But we can also think about more abstract things, like things that haven't even been built yet. I'm looking at Stephen, who's an architect, and what architects do, I guess, is you create in your mind a building, and then put it down on paper, and then eventually it becomes a real building. But it starts in the mind, creating this idea of something that will later be created. But it's the same with scientists, inventors, or artists, lots of people who create. So it starts off in the mind first, and then if they're fortunate, if things go well, then it will become an actual physical thing. Yeah, so our mental consciousness can be very, very creative. Okay, so the next bullet point mentions some synonyms. So these terms, I put the Tibetan in case you do know Tibetan and you want to. It is useful to know the Tibetan terms because, like I say, some different translators and different teachers will translate the same Tibetan term with different English terms. So it can, especially with this topic, if you read different books, it can be very confusing because one translator is using one term and another translator is using another term. So going back to the Tibetan term can be useful. Okay, so mind or awareness, I've already talked about that, lo in Tibetan. And consciousness is another term, shepa in Tibetan. And yeah, so that's actually synonymous. It's a different word, but it's still talking about the same thing. This stuff that is clear and knowing, this stuff inside of us. And the third term is rikpa in Tibetan, which can be translated as a knower or cognizer. And this is a little tricky because that term rikpa is used in, I haven't studied much, Dzogchen. Dzogchen is a type of practice in the Nyingma tradition, and they use this term rikpa a lot, but it has a different meaning in that context. I won't go into that meaning because I'm not qualified to talk about it. But yeah, the first time I attended some teachings on Dzogchen, His Holiness was giving those teachings, and they kept using this term rikpa. And I was already familiar with this meaning of rikpa, but it was being used in a different way, and they didn't really explain what it meant. So I spent some time being confused about that. So even with the Tibetan terms, you do have to be careful because sometimes those Tibetan terms can have different meanings in different contexts. But here, in the context of this topic, Lorik, it simply means a knower or a cognizer. So what that means is each moment, and another thing too is mind is not, well, that's coming next. Our mind is not a single monolithic thing, but is a stream or continuum of individual mind moments or experiences. So when we hear the term mind, we might get this idea that it's just this one thing somewhere inside of us that just has different experiences. But we may have a sense of it being, partless and whole and monolithic. It's not like that. It's more like a stream. And they even use that term sometimes. They talk about a mind stream or mind continuum. It's more like a stream or a river, which if you think about it, it's made up of many, many different molecules and atoms, and it's flowing and changing all the time. That's what a river is like. So our mind is similar to that in that it is made up of individual parts, each of which is an experience, a moment of experience that simply arises and then passes, and the next one arises and passes, and the next one arises and passes. So each part of our mind, each experience in our mind is something that lasts just a very, very brief amount of time, and then it's gone. But it's immediately replaced by the next one. There's no gap in between. So it can appear like a continuous thing. I like to think of this old, the old kind of movies when they first made movies. There was this, like, you call it a strip of celluloid, with these individual frames. And then that would run through a machine with a light to, cast the image on the screen. So it looked like people doing things, moving, cowboys shooting each other and so on. And when it's up on the screen, it looks like a continuous thing. But if you look at the actual this film that's causing those appearances, it's just made up of these individual frames, and they're moving so fast that it looks like a continuous thing. So I think that's a good analogy to understand our mind. Our mind, if we were to look at it with super fine microscope or a Buddha mind, we would see that there's just these individual moments of experience, but they move so fast, change so fast, it can look like one continuous thing. Does that make sense? So it's hard for us to experience that ourselves. It takes a mind that's very concentrated, has very, very good concentration and very good mindfulness, and to be able to observe the mind and notice how it is made up of these individual moments of mind that are rising and passing, changing all the time. But this is what the Buddha and those more highly accomplished beings say. And we can start to get a taste of it ourselves when we do practice meditation and just observe our mind, and we can see how, it's changing all the time. So in a sense, it would be more accurate to use the term minds in the plural rather than mind in the singular, because there isn't just one mind, but there's many minds, constantly coming and going. And so our mind is always running, always active, experiencing things. So even when a person is unconscious, like asleep or in a coma, they're not really unconscious because there's still consciousness there. There's still mind, there's still awareness, even though it's at a very, very deep level. There's always something going on in the mind. We know that when we're sleeping. Sometimes our mind can be incredibly active with our dreams. But according to Buddhism, even when we're in a dreamless state, we talk about dreamless sleep. Even when there's no dreams happening, there's still something happening in our mind. It never shuts off. It's always doing something, experiencing something, 24 hours a day, nonstop. Okay, so that's just an introduction to the mind itself. Then the next point, letter B, sense consciousnesses and mental consciousnesses. So I did already talk about that a little bit. But this is one way of dividing minds. So as I mentioned, it's more accurate to talk about minds in the plural rather than mind in the singular, because it's actually multiple minds. And in the study of Lorig, minds, this mass of multiple minds can be divided up in different ways. Similar to if we wanted to study human beings, we can divide human beings into different groups according to different criteria, like gender or nationality or age or whether they like ice cream or they don't like ice cream. So we can divide human beings into different groups depending on what kind of criteria we're using. So this is done in Lorig. So there's these different ways of dividing up mind according to different criteria. So this is one way, sense consciousnesses and mental consciousnesses. And this way of dividing them is according to what kind of sense power or sense faculty is part of that experience, is one of the factors giving rise to that experience. So the there's 5 sense consciousnesses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, or body consciousness. So to be able to have any of those experiences, there needs to be a sense power or a sense faculty that is in good working order. So to be able to see, we have to have an eye faculty or eye sense power, which is functioning. It doesn't function for everybody. Some people are unable to see. They're blind or visually impaired. So there's something wrong with that sense power or sense faculty. And according to Buddhism, the sense faculty isn't just this gross eyeball we can see, but it's said to be a very subtle kind of matter in the eye. It actually cannot be seen. So you could dissect an eye and you wouldn't be able to see this sense power explained in Buddhism. But that's the actual thing. According to Buddhism, that's the actual thing that enables seeing to take place. So if that is absent or damaged or whatever, then a person would not be able to have that particular sense consciousness. They would not be able to see things. And then this with the ears, again, there's this subtle kind of form or matter somewhere inside the ear that enables hearing to take place. And again, for some people, that is impaired or missing, and so they're not able to hear. So there's some people who can't hear at all. They're totally deaf, or they're hearing impaired, especially when we get older. That happens quite a lot. And with the nose, again, there's some subtle matter inside the nose, inside the nostrils, that enable that experience of smelling odors. And again, that's sometimes damaged. Like that was one of the effects of COVID. People who had COVID would lose that sense of smell. And taste. So there's some subtle matter inside the tongue that enables the experience of tasting. And again, that can be sometimes impaired. Like people with COVID had, there's a connection, it seems, between sense of smell and sense of taste. So if one is damaged, the other can be damaged as well. And then the body, for the body sense power, they say that exists all throughout the body. That isn't just located in one place, but it pervades the body. So it's some kind of subtle matter that exists all over the body that enables the experience of body consciousness or tactile consciousness, sensations with the body. So each of those 5 sense consciousnesses occur in dependence on their own respective sense power or sense faculty. Okay, so the eye consciousness depends on the eye faculty. It doesn't depend on the ear faculty. And so you could have a well-functioning ear faculty, but if your eye faculty is damaged, you won't be able to see things. Okay, so each of the 5 sense consciousnesses has its own faculty or sense power that it depends on to be able to have that type of experience. And yeah, those 5 sense powers or sense faculties are physical in nature. They're subtle kind of matter or form, the term used. Now the 6th consciousness, mental consciousness, that also has a faculty or power, but it's not a physical thing. Instead, the what's called the mental sense power is the previous moment of mind. So the previous moment of mind is termed the sense power for the next moment of mind. Okay, so if I have a particular thought, the sense power giving rise to that thought, that's not the only thing. The sense power is only one of the conditions, one of the causes for an experience to arise. But there are other causes as well, such as an object. There has to be an object that is seen or experienced. But the sense power is a very important one, because if that's missing or not functioning, then that experience won't happen. So for the mental consciousness, like a thought or a memory or a dream, the sense power for that is the previous moment of mind rather than any kind of physical sense power. It is important in the sense that now, like if any of our sense powers or sense faculties is damaged or missing, then that would affect our ability to have those kinds of experiences. And if we don't have certain of our sensory experiences, that will also affect our mental consciousness. If we cannot see or if we cannot hear, then that will affect what we can know, what we can understand, how we experience things. So every moment of mind, every experience that we have will be one of those 6. It will be either one of the 5 sense consciousnesses or it will be a mental consciousness. Then letter C is perceptions and conceptions. This is another way of dividing up minds. So every mind, every moment of mind is either a perception or a conception. The difference between them is how they engage with their object. So a perception, the literal term in Tibetan is actually non-conceptual mind, but we use the term perception just to make it easier. So that engages with its object directly. Now, this is the case with all the five sense consciousnesses. They are perceptions. When we see something, we're directly engaging with what we see. Our mind is able to, contact that object directly. And the same with hearing, smelling, tasting, and body consciousness. So there's a direct connection between the consciousness and the object. That doesn't mean, I think there's different schools explaining how that actually works. There's one school, the Vibhashika school, that says that the consciousness actually goes out and contacts the object directly. I find that very strange, but anyway, that's one point of view within Buddhism. So if I'm looking at Venerable Damcha over there, then my eye consciousness is actually going out and touching Venerable Damcha. But then I think, well, what about stars? And the sun and the moon? Does our consciousness actually go all the way there and touch those? Anyway, so that's one point of view. Other schools say, no, it's not like that, but it's more like a reflection. This is going to come up later, that the object casts a kind of reflection onto our mind, and then mind will arise in a kind of, they use the term aspect. The mind takes on an aspect of that object, similar to the way a mirror works. So when you have a mirror and there's something right in front of the mirror, then the mirror will take on a reflection of that object, whatever is in front of it. So they say that's a little bit similar to the way that our mind perceives things. It takes on an aspect, a reflection of the object. But anyway, so our five senses have this direct connection with the object, perceiving it directly. And that becomes a little more clear when we look at this other type of mind, which is conception, which could also be called thought. When we have conception or thought, our mind doesn't contact the object in a direct way, as with perception, but instead it contacts the object through the medium of a mental image. Sometimes it's called mental image. Venerable Children uses the term conceptual appearance. Sometimes it's called generic image. That's actually a very precise translation of the Tibetan. So there's, again, different translators using different terms in English. But what it is just an image of the object rather than the actual object. So if we think about, last night I saw a deer when I left here and I started walking towards Gautami, and there was a deer in the path. And I like seeing deer, so I really paid attention to the deer, and I was really trying to make sure I didn't scare her, I think it was a her, away. So I can think about that deer now. She's probably not still standing there on that path. She disappeared a long time ago. But I can still remember that experience of seeing the deer and have a kind of mental image or a mental picture in my mind of that deer, even while I'm sitting here right now. So that's what happens when we have a thought or a conception. We're not directly contacting an object, but instead experiencing it via a mental image. And so again, this is something happening all day long. If we watch our mind, we pay attention to our mind, we're having many, many different thoughts. And whenever we have thoughts, the objects that we are thinking about, people or animals or places or food or whatever it is, what we're experiencing is really just a mental image of that object rather than the actual object, as when we see it or hear it. So I gave some examples here, just so you can understand these better. So some examples of perceptions: seeing a tree, hearing a bird singing, smelling bread baking, tasting chocolate, feeling cold. So those are examples of each of our 5 senses. So we're having those, very frequently during the day. And then conceptions, so examples of conceptions: remembering a conversation that we had earlier today or yesterday or last week, thinking about a friend who may be somewhere else right now, far away, but we can think of them and have a mental image of them. And then doing analytical meditation on impermanence. So anytime we do analytical meditation, we're using conceptual mind, we're using thought. We're deliberately bringing to mind some topic like impermanence, and then bringing to mind different aspects of impermanence so that we have a better understanding of it, bringing in our own experiences, things we've heard from our teachers, things that we've read in a book. So we're busy processing that particular topic of impermanence. So that's thought, conception. And visualizing the Buddha. So when we do that kind of practice, visualizing Buddha or Tara or Chenrezig, that's also using this type of mind, conceptual mind. So I got some questions the other day from somebody who attended the last course, Know Your Mind, and in looking for answers to her questions, I was looking at different materials online, and I came across an article on a website called Lumen, which is kind of offering different educational topics that people can learn about. So they were talking about sensation. So it seems like in the scientific community, or at least some branches of science, they use the term sensation for what I'm calling perception. Okay, and they use the word perception for what seems to be conception. So they said sensation is our ability to detect and sense the internal and external physical qualities of our environment. And our primary senses are sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, which is, so they use the term sensation for those kinds of experiences. And then they had the term perception, and they described perception as the mental processes that represent understanding of the real world causes of sensory input. So in other words, after we get sensory input from the environment, then our mind or brain, they were talking about the brain, the brain will process that information and come up with mental representations. So that to me sounds more like conception, what we call conception. So they're using the term perception for conception, what we call conception, and then sensation for what we're calling perception. So I'm just throwing that out there because, again, the same term can mean different things in different contexts. So that's why it's always good to have an explanation of what that particular term means in this context. So here in Buddhism, at least in this context, we're talking about we're using the word perception for our sensory experiences, conception for the mind processing those experiences and thinking about them and understanding them and so on. Then at the bottom of the page 1, it says perceptions and conceptions can be either correct or wrong. So here's some examples for perceptions. Correct perceptions, examples: seeing green as green, seeing a tree as a tree. Wrong perceptions: seeing green as red. So I've heard people who have color blindness will misperceive colors. Or maybe they're seeing it right and everybody else is seeing it wrong. I don't know. But anyway, they see colors in a different way than other people. So they might see something green and think that it's red or appears red to them. And another one that we all have, or we can have sometimes, seeing a mirror reflection as a real object. So when something is reflected in a mirror, especially if you don't know that the mirror is there, you walk into a room, you've never been there before, and there's a mirror on the wall, or sometimes the whole wall is covered with mirrors and you don't know it, and you see things. You might even see, oh, I had a twin. I didn't know I had a twin. And yeah, that lasts only a moment, and then you realize, oh, that was a mirror. But that initial experience of seeing what is just a reflection, but not knowing it's a reflection, and instead thinking it's the real thing. So that would be an example of a wrong perception. Another one is a mirage, when see in the desert or sometimes on asphalt, if the sun is really, really, really hot, there appears what looks like water. It really looks like water. You could swear it was water. But you go up close and realize it's not water. It's just an appearance of water because of the conditions. So seeing water where there is no water is also a wrong perception. And so wrong perceptions can occur due to different factors. Sometimes something wrong with your sense faculty, or under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and we can have mistaken perceptions of things, or situations like with the mirage, the hot sun, the dry surface, sand or asphalt or whatever. So those conditions produce this appearance. And then for conceptions, correct conceptions, examples would be thinking that the earth is spherical. That may sound strange, but an example of a wrong one is thinking that the earth is flat. There are people who, believe it or not, they still think the world is flat. They have doubt that the world is round. Hard to believe. But anyway, there's lots of wrong conceptions going on these days with all the media and disinformation and fake news and so on, and people believing them. Another example of a correct conception would be thinking that our body is impermanent, because it is impermanent, it's changing all the time. But there are people who think otherwise and think that the body is permanent, unchanging, always the same. So it is useful to know that there are correct conceptions and wrong conceptions, because our afflictive emotions, anger, attachment, jealousy, arrogance, ignorance, these are all examples of wrong conceptions. They are wrong conceptions. Seeing things incorrectly, seeing things other than how they are. So initially, when we first hear about that, we might feel some resistance. What are you saying? I'm wrong? I'm not wrong. I'm right. I know things. So we can sometimes be reluctant to accept, to acknowledge that our way of thinking can sometimes be wrong. And that's a big hindrance. If you don't want to acknowledge that you're wrong about things, then you keep going in those wrong ways of thinking and keep experiencing suffering and problem. So it is important to at least be willing to accept that you are sometimes wrong. And then work on clearing up the misconceptions. So those are just some of the things I covered last time in June, the weekend course we had in June. If you want to know more about those, you could go back and listen to those talks. And also, if you have any questions about the material, I'd prefer not to take them right now, but you can send the questions in, and I'll give some time in the afternoon session to answer those questions, because I would like to move on now to the new material we're going to be focusing on in this weekend. So that starts with letter D in the handout, main minds and mental factors. And so this is another way of dividing minds. Multiple minds. They can be divided into main minds and mental factors. And this way of dividing them is from the point of view of their function, meaning how they engage with their object, the role they play in knowing an object. So a main mind, and another term for this is primary mind or primary consciousness. So again, different books, different translators will use different terms. I just like main mind because it's short and simple. Primary consciousness. It's a little longer. So main mind, wholesome in Tibetan. So this knows the mere presence of an object, just the bare fact that there is an object. And there are 6 types of main minds related to these 6 senses that we've been talking about already. Now, the official term is eye, primary consciousness, but that just means seeing. Seeing, ear, primary consciousness, hearing, and then nose, tongue, body, and mental. So with regard to each of our 6 senses, there is a main mind or primary consciousness, which is simply aware of the object without going into any details about the object or reacting to the object in any way. So it's just knowing the object is there. So that'll become more clear when we go into the mental factors, because if you look, just below that, mental factors, semjung in Tibetan, there are many of these, and what they do is they apprehend various features of the object and affect the way the mind apprehends the object. So there are many different mental factors. The Buddhist scriptures come up with more than 100. There's maybe even more than that. But usually we just study 51 mental factors. Those are considered the main ones, the most important ones. So it says mind and mental factors always work together, never separately. And I made this little drawing just to help you have some idea. But don't take this literally, because again, mind is not something physical. It doesn't have shape or size or color or any physical properties at all, but just to help us get an idea. So every experience we have, whether it's a thought or a visual perception, seeing or hearing, or any individual experience we have, consists of one main mind. There's always just one main mind, but then there's a number of mental factors that are together with that main mind. They're kind of in one package. They come together in one package, and they can't be separated. So it's not possible to have a main mind all by itself without any mental factors together with it. And it's also not possible to have any mental factor just floating around by itself, not connected with a main mind and other mental factors. So they always have to come together in a package. And I give an example here of when we see a flower. So when we have the experience of looking at a flower, that experience of seeing the flower consists of an I, primary consciousness. That's a main mind. So there's the I consciousness, or seeing, to make it simple. That's the main mind. And then together with that, in the same package, inseparably, are several mental factors. And there's always at least 5 mental factors. That's the minimum number. You can never have less than 5. That'll get more clear later. We'll go through those 5. One of them is feeling. So feeling is an omnipresent or ever-present mental factor that's always there with every single experience we have. And the function of feeling is to experience the object as either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. There's just three kinds of feelings. And one of those three kinds of feelings is always there. So if it's a pretty flower and if we like flowers, then we'll probably have a pleasant feeling. But if it's an ugly flower, or if you're allergic to flowers and they make you sneeze and you can't stand them, then when you see a flower, you may have an unpleasant experience because you're thinking of the reaction that's going to happen. And it's also possible to have just a neutral feeling. Maybe if your mind is busy thinking of things, and then you see the flower, but you don't really feel anything about it. It's also possible to have just a neutral feeling. But that's just to illustrate that the mental factors, like in this case, feeling is a mental factor. So feeling has a particular role to play in our experience of the object. We'll experience the object as pleasant or unpleasant, or neither, neutral. Another mental factor that's always present every single moment is discrimination or discernment. And that the function of that is to be able to notice distinguishing characteristics of the object so we can tell it from something else. So we can know the difference between a flower and a cat, or between yellow and blue. Okay, so that particular mental factor has that job of distinguishing features or characteristics of an object. And this is pre-thought, preconception, because it isn't that discrimination says that is blue, that is yellow, that is a flower, that is a cat. It's just a bare, basic recognition that one object is different from other objects. Because even animals who don't know language, they don't have language. You know? But they can still tell the difference between a cat and a dog. Yeah, so if it's a cat that they like, they'll feel happy and go towards it. If it's a dog, they'll probably get scared and their fur will stand up and they'll probably run away. So they are able to have this discernment, this ability to distinguish one object from another, even without having conceptual thought and naming and labeling. So it's just a very bare, basic recognition of different objects. So that's just an example of how there's a main mind, one single main mind, accompanied by different mental factors, and the different mental factors have a different role to play. And they can't be separated. They always come together. Might be useful just to pause here for a moment and just take a look at our mind and see if we can make sense of some of this material. There's a lot of words, a lot of ideas, and just to see how it actually happens in our own experience. So make yourself comfortable. And to start with, have your eyes open, but not looking around the room. Instead just have your eyes looking down on whatever's in front of you, the table or the floor. And just be aware of seeing, the experience of seeing objects, which is sometimes called visual consciousness or eye consciousness. But it's just that experience of seeing visual objects. And normally we pay more attention to the object. We focus on the object and get involved with the object. But now, see if you can turn your attention inward and observe the mind that is seeing. the experience of seeing itself. Now, this is not easy to do, so you may not be able to do it. But just try to notice that there's this subjective side, the seeing of that object. Also try to be aware that this seeing isn't constant, the same experience over a period of time, but it's more like a stream or continuum of individual moments, arising and passing, arising and passing, each one lasting just a very short period of time, and then ceasing, and immediately the next one comes up. So it's actually a series of moments, mental events of seeing even just one object. And each of these moments of mind, seeing the object, is like a package that consists of one main mind or primary mind, which is just aware of the object. And together with that, there are a number of different mental factors, such as feeling, experiencing the object as pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. Now, this is very difficult to actually recognize, but just try to keep in mind that this is how it's explained in Buddhism. Now you can let your eyes close and turn your attention to the experience of hearing sounds. So there's some sounds coming from outside, machinery in the room or in the building, and there may be internal sounds as well, especially if you have tinnitus. Constant sound. So again, try to pay more attention to the experiencing of the sound rather than the sound, the object. So there is the object, but then there's the mind experiencing that object, knowing that object. And again, that mind is changing all the time, more like a stream, a river of individual moments of experience, hearing that sound. And each moment of hearing the sound is also composed of different parts, such as a main mind, hearing, ear consciousness, plus a number of mental factors like feeling, reacting to the object, feeling pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. Now tune to body consciousness. So that includes all the sensations we have in our body. Some might be pleasant, comfortable, others might be unpleasant, aches, pains, sharp feelings, tight feelings, pressure, tension. So again, try not to pay so much attention to the object that's being experienced, but the subject, the mind experiencing that object. And now turn to the sixth consciousness, the mental consciousness. So that consists of thoughts, memories, thoughts about the future, other places, people, and so on. And emotions, feeling angry or annoyed or feeling happy, joyful. So just pay attention to whatever's happening on that level with the understanding that it's constantly changing. There's no single thought or emotion or memory that's fixed, permanent, always there, but they're more like bubbles arising and passing, arising and passing. And as before, try to pay less attention to the object of the thought and see if you can be more aware of the thought itself, the mind that is aware of that mental object. And now for a few minutes, just try to be aware of feelings which could arise with any of the 6 sensory experiences: hearing a sound, or feeling a sensation in the body, or having a thought. Now, many of our feelings probably go unnoticed, but just try to notice at least some of the feelings. Again, feeling is either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So later today, when we meet again, we'll go into the actual mental factors, start to go through the mental factors. But this one about feeling is particularly important because feeling, if we're not careful, it can lead to afflictive emotions. When we have an unpleasant feeling towards some object, then that can lead to aversion or unhappiness or fear, anxiety, all these unpleasant and sometimes destructive states of mind. And it all starts with an unpleasant feeling. So if we can be more aware of unpleasant feelings when they arise, and then do something before it builds up and becomes anger or hatred or aversion, or wanting to do something destructive, then we'll save ourselves a lot of trouble, not so likely to create negative karma or get ourselves into a bad state of mind, which could last for hours or days. It's not easy to do, of course, but it's one of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Very important practice, especially in the Theravada tradition. So there are these 4 objects that you train yourself to pay attention to. The body is the first one. Feelings is the second one. So there's a whole practice of training oneself to be aware of feelings. And that's the main reason, the main purpose is to catch feelings before they develop into afflictives. So I mentioned unpleasant feelings can lead to aversion and anger, and pleasant feelings can lead to attachment. Attachment and craving. I want more, I want more, I want more. Yeah, so that's what usually happens with ordinary people. And as practitioners of the Dharma, those who are trying to follow the Buddha's teachings, follow the path to liberation and nirvana, that's one of the things we need to work on, is decreasing our afflictive emotions. And if we can catch the feeling before, or at least early on, then there's greater chance of stopping our mind from getting completely caught up in afflictive emotions. So we'll stop here, and I really feel confident, even if you find this material difficult and it may seem kind of abstract and difficult to figure out how to put it into practice, but it is important. And so any effort we make to try to learn more about our mind so that we can work on it is very positive, very beneficial. So we definitely did create some merit, some positive energy. Now we share this, that it will bring benefit, peace, and happiness to all living beings.